Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space. Close your eyes and let the story begin. Story 1: Making Friends with Death. I met him for the first time on a windy December afternoon, as snow began to fall gently outside the window of a small café tucked away at the end of Main Street, right in the heart of Derry, Maine. I was skipping work that day, also ignoring a call from my mother, because I knew she'd ask why I hadn't come home for Christmas. I didn't have the heart to answer that. Not after the death of my best friend, Katie. The cafe had the old-fashioned name, the Raven's Nest, with warm yellow lights and vintage jazz spinning softly from a record player in the corner. I chose a seat by the window, ordered a cappuccino, opened my notebook, and tried to write. But the pages stayed blank, like my mind. Empty, exhausted, lost. Until the man sat down at the table across from me, and I hadn't even noticed. "Grieving a friend's death?" he asked, his voice as soft as cigarette smoke drifting in the air. I froze. I hadn't told anyone in this town about Katie. She'd died 3 weeks ago in New York, in a strange accident. No one really knew why she ran into the street in the middle of the night. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled. His smile was strange. It held neither life nor pretense, like someone imitating human emotion without quite understanding it. "I'm just someone who enjoys coffee and honest conversations," he said. "My name is Eli." I don't know why I didn't stand up and walk away then. Maybe it was his eyes, so deep, so still, like staring into the bottom of a bottomless pit. Or maybe it was because I was lonely, and he seemed to understand me better than anyone. "How do you know about Katie?" I asked, setting my notebook down. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me for a long time, then whispered, "I was there." My hands clenched. A chill slithered up my spine. "What do you mean? You saw her die?" "No," Eli said, his voice even. "I arrived right after. I saw her soul. She didn't understand what had happened, just like so many others." I gave a dry, nervous laugh, trying to shake off the shiver crawling down my back. "Are you some kind of psychic?" "Not quite. I don't connect with spirits. I just guide them," he said. "And I'm here for you, Claire." I froze when he said my name. My real name, not the nickname I used online or at the cafe. My eyes darted around, searching for a sign that this was some sick prank. But the place was nearly empty. Just an old woman reading in the corner, and the barista, half asleep behind the counter. "Who are you?" I whispered. Eli tilted his head. "Do you believe in fate, Claire? That there are moments, tiny decisions, that can lead us to the end?" I didn't answer. "Like taking the shortcut through the woods yesterday, instead of the main road. Or ignoring your mother's call this morning. Small things, but they shape a much larger outcome." My heart was pounding. How did he know all that? He pulled an old pocket watch from his coat and opened it, gazing inside. "Claire, you have 2 days. 2 days for what?" "2 days to choose. I'm not here to take you. Not yet. But time waits for no one." I shot to my feet. "What kind of game is this? Who sent you?" "My mom." Or is this some sick joke by some creep online? Eli didn't react. He simply stood, slowly, like he had all the time in the universe. Before leaving the table, he said, "If you want to understand, come to Glen Hill Cemetery at 3 a.m. tonight. And remember, don't bring anyone." I didn't go to the cemetery at 3 a.m. Of course not. I wasn't insane, but at 2:47 a.m., I woke up from a nightmare, drenched in sweat. In the dream, I saw Katie, her face disfigured, her eyes rolled white, her lips mouthing words again and again. "He's not lying. Claire, listen, before it's too late." And I went. I don't know why, but I went. As if something bigger than me was pulling each step forward. Glen Hill was an old cemetery, cold and desolate, like it was made to swallow the weak at night. The pale moon drifted silently above. I walked between the tombstones, heart pounding, until I saw Eli standing next to a freshly dug grave. It had no name. "You came," he said. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified, but I asked, "What is this?" Eli knelt and touched the grave. "It's your death. If you change nothing, tomorrow you'll be buried here." I gave a dry laugh, throat burning. I thought fate couldn't be changed. It can't. But human emotions can bend some things. He looked up at me. "But there's something you need to know, Claire. If you save yourself, death will come for the one you love most." I stood frozen. "Your mother, or your little brother in Chicago, or..." "No." I shook my head, voice cracking. "You can't touch them." "Then what do you choose?" That question still echoed in my mind long after I left the cemetery. And somehow, the sound of my footsteps didn't feel like they were the only ones there. I had hoped that the next morning would wash everything away like a bad dream. That I was simply haunted by the grief of losing my best friend. And the man named Eli was just some weirdo from town. But when I opened my eyes, the floor was already bathed in a pale morning glow. And beneath the door was something that nearly stole my breath. A letter slid through the door gap, written on yellowed parchment without a seal, no return address. I slowed my steps, every hair on my neck standing upright. As I picked it up, I recognized the handwriting on the envelope. It was Katie's, to Claire, the one who must make a choice. My hands trembled as I tore the paper open. Slanted, shaky handwriting appeared, each word smudged as though written through tears. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means Eli has already found you. I don't know what he is or where he comes from, but before it happened, he told me one thing. He said I had to write this letter to warn the next one. I know it sounds crazy, but he knew everything. Even about me hiding the pregnancy from you, about the suicidal thoughts, and how I would die just as you were calling. And I didn't answer. Claire, don't fully trust Eli. He doesn't lie, but he doesn't tell the truth either. Something else is with him. That thing, it was in my mirror for days before I died. Be careful with mirrors. They no longer reflect just you." "Katie," I collapsed into the chair. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating, like the walls were inching closer. My eyes drifted to the mirror across from my bed. The one I used every morning. It was still there, silent as ever. But now, I didn't dare look at it too long. I had the dreadful feeling that if I stared long enough, I'd see another version of myself, smiling from the other side. After that letter, I packed my bags and returned to my mother's house in Bangor. She had lived alone since my father passed away from cancer a few years back. I never told her what was happening. I simply said I needed a break. But on the very first night back, I started hearing the knocking. Not on the door, on the bathroom mirror. 3 knocks. Always at exactly 3:13 a.m. The first night, I thought it was a dream. The second night, I woke up, grabbed a fruit knife, and crept toward the bathroom. The house was dead silent. My mother slept at the other end of the hall, but the knocks were clear. 3 knocks, spaced out, slow, like someone tapping from the other side. I didn't open the bathroom door. I just stood there, staring at the doorknob, until the knocking stopped. The next morning, I covered the mirror with black duct tape. That night, there were no knocks, but it laughed. From behind the taped-up glass, I heard laughter, soft but hissing through clenched teeth. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to hear laughter without sound. It echoed somewhere between my ears and my mind. Promising, primal, like the breath of a beast that had stalked its prey long enough. I decided to do the one thing every horror story character gets yelled at for. I went back to the Raven's Nest. I needed to find Eli. But when I got there, the bar was closed. Not just recently shut down, like it had never existed at all. The windows were boarded up with rotting wood. The sign had peeled away. I asked a nearby newspaper vendor. That place? The old man squinted. Burned down back in 2012. People died. Some girl went missing too, if I remember right. I asked. 2012? Katie used to live in Derry in 2012, before she moved to New York. I never asked why she left. I returned to my car, weighed down with dread. On the drive back, I glanced into the rearview mirror, and my heart nearly leapt from my chest. Someone was sitting behind me. Not someone. A shadow shaped like a person. No face, no features. Just a dense black mass like ink blooming underwater. I whipped around. The back seat was empty, but the mirror still reflected it. I covered the mirror with my hand and floored the gas pedal, as if hell itself was chasing me down the road. That night, I got a call from my mother. She was panicked, seeing a man in black had come by the house asking for me. He didn't give a name, only left one thing, a pocket watch. Eli's pocket watch. I begged her not to open it, told her to seal it in a metal box and put it in the freezer. Instinctively, I didn't want time to move anymore. A few hours later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You can't run forever. Life and death are 2 halves of the same door. Choose, Claire. Choose who opens it first. And just when Claire thought the choice only revolved around her, someone else, her younger brother, Jason, had just been in a car accident in Chicago. In critical condition, I rushed to the Chicago hospital in the middle of the night. The flight lasted 3 hours, but it felt like I had been sitting there for years. Every time I closed my eyes, Eli's pocket watch would appear in my mind. Its face had no hands. Just a single word, spinning endlessly at the center. Choose. Jason, my younger brother, was hit head-on by a runaway truck while crossing the street. According to the doctors, what was strange was that there were no skid marks, no clear witnesses, and no footage from any nearby cameras. It was as if both the truck and its driver were ghosts. My brother survived, but he was in a deep coma. When I arrived, Jason lay motionless on the hospital bed, face pale, bandages wrapped around his head and chest. His heartbeat was still there, weak but steady. Beside him sat my mother, trembling as she held Jason's hand, whispering prayers under her breath. I didn't cry. I had no tears left to cry. since Katie died. Then what happened with Eli, with the mirror, and now Jason. I no longer knew what was real anymore. But I knew one thing. Everything was leading to a moment where I would have to choose. And I couldn't keep running. That night, I stayed at the hospital, sleeping on a stiffy chair in the waiting room. When I opened my eyes, it was around 3 a.m. I saw a nurse standing in front of Jason's room. She had her back to me, with long black hair and wearing the standard white hospital uniform. But something was wrong. She stood still, too still, for too long. I called out, "Excuse me?" No response. I stood up, slowly walked toward her. As I approached, she turned around. It wasn't a person. Its face was smooth like wax. No eyes, no nose, just a gaping mouth slashed wide from ear to ear. And it was smiling. I didn't even have time to think. I screamed. A real nurse came running, but when I turned back, it was gone. I stammered out a description, but everyone just looked at me with pity. One doctor even gave me the number of a psychiatrist. I scoffed. They didn't understand. The next morning, I received another letter. No return address. Just a thin slip of paper placed beneath the pillow in my hotel room. I was certain I had locked the door. I always locked all 3 locks and used the bolt too. But the letter still came. The paper was thin, almost like skin. And the handwriting. It was Katie's again. "Claire, Eli won't force you. But if you don't choose, someone else will. And they won't be kind. There's a place where every soul, once trapped between life and death, has passed through. They call it Room 0. If you dare to enter, you'll know everything. But not everyone comes back. That room is in the hospital basement floor to the right at the last hallway." I should have thrown the paper away, should have ignored it. But I had no way back. At 9 p.m. that night, I left Jason's room, saying I was going to find a vending machine. Then I headed straight for the basement hallway. There were no cameras there. The basement door was slightly ajar. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a pale glow down the corridor. The air was cold. So cold, my breath came out in mist. I counted each door. Medical storage, supply room, morgue. At the very end of the hallway was an old iron door with no nameplate. Only the number "0" scratched into it, as if with fingernails. I placed my hand on the handle. My heart pounded wildly. The door swung open without a sound. Inside was pitch black. But still, I stepped in. The air inside was colder than outside. There was no light, yet I could still see. Some dim illumination emanated from the walls. I couldn't tell. The room wasn't big, but it wasn't empty. There were iron beds, like hospital beds, but lying on them weren't the living. They were still shapes, covered in white sheets, but the sheets rose and fell, like something was breathing beneath. At the center of the room stood a large wooden table. On it were 3 mirrors, identical, terrifyingly so. And then, from the darkness, Eli stepped out. "Welcome, Claire. You chose to walk through," he said. His voice was calm, but something in his eyes had changed. He looked tired. I didn't speak. I waited for him to explain. Eli walked to the table, placing his hand on one of the mirrors. "These are the embodiments of choice. Each mirror shows a possible reality." "I don't understand," I said. "Look into each mirror. You'll see the future if you choose that path." He paused. "But remember, only one can be chosen." I stepped closer. The first mirror. I saw myself sitting beside Jason's bed. He was awake, healthy, smiling. But my mother lay in a coffin. The second, my mother was in the kitchen, laughing. But Jason's photo sat on an altar in the living room. The third, both Mom and Jason were alive. But I was the one in the coffin, eyes wide open. I turned to Eli. I can't save both? No death comes without a price, Claire, he replied, his voice almost sad. Every choice is blood for blood. I didn't want to choose. But when I turned back, the mirrors were gone. In their place was a new door, just behind Eli. A voice echoed, not Eli's, but a woman's voice, Katie's voice. Claire, there is a fourth way, but it's not for the faint of heart. And in the darkness beyond that door, Claire would face something that didn't belong to this world. Something even Eli dared not name. When that door opened, I felt like I had just stepped into a place where time didn't exist. The space inside was nothing but absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that light itself seemed unable to penetrate. I stood there in an endless void, silent, unsure of what to do next. Eli was gone. It was just me in a crushing silence, thick with what felt like thousands of unseen sighs. My hands were icy cold, my back soaked in sweat. But it wasn't fear. It was something else. Like I had come too close to something the human mind wasn't meant to comprehend. The door behind me shut on its own, noiselessly, as if it had never been opened. A strange sensation washed over me, like I had been sealed inside an invisible space. The cold seeped into my bones, and I could feel something reaching out from within the darkness. Not a creature, but something intangible, like a shadow, like a nightmare. Claire. That voice echoed. Not Eli's, that voice. I couldn't describe it. It was like a whisper from deep within the void, coming from corners I couldn't see. But I recognized it instantly. It was Katie's voice. Katie? I stammered, my own voice weak in the empty space. Katie, is that you? A soft laugh answered, but it wasn't hers. It was dry and hollow, like the laughter of souls stripped of feeling and hope. And then, from the shadows, a figure began to take form. It wasn't Katie. It was a woman, but someone I had never seen before. Long black hair fell around her, but there was something unnatural about her. Her eyes weren't eyes at all, but hollow sockets, deep, endless pits of darkness. Her lips curled into a cold smile, as if she took joy in my confusion. You shouldn't be here, Claire, she said, her voice hoarse like a paradoxical warning. But now that you are, don't expect to leave so easily. I stepped back, anxiety rising sharply inside me. Who are you? I asked, though I knew the question was meaningless in this place. She took a step toward me. Each movement seemed to crush the very air around her. I am part of those who chose wrong. A scream tore through the darkness, not hers, not mine. It was the cry of countless souls writhing in this place, souls I'd never known, yet could feel surrounding me. They were here, in the shadows, in the mirrors, in the darkness, in me. You can't escape, Claire, she whispered, her lips stretching into a terrible grin. Everything you do will only delay death. I looked around, lost, not knowing who or what to trust. Her laughter rang endlessly, like a funeral bell tolling deep in my chest. The feeling of being trapped in a place with no exits, no life, no hope. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. Then I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. Claire? It was Jason's voice. My heart clenched. How was that possible? He was still in the hospital, in a coma. How could he be calling me? But I didn't have time to question it. I only knew one thing. If I didn't act, if I didn't follow that voice, then everything I had just seen would become real. I would never be able to save anyone again. I turned and ran toward the voice. But as soon as I turned my back, the darkness behind me began to shift. You can't escape, Claire. Her voice again, but this time not a warning, a threat. I ran, but my legs felt like they were filled with lead. Every step dragged, like something was trying to hold me back. When I dared to glance behind me, I saw her shadow still standing there, smiling coldly. This won't end the way you think. I didn't look back again. My eyes locked on the door at the end of the hallway. The one I knew, if I could just pass through it, would bring me back to the real world. But as I neared it, the door changed. It had become a mirror. A giant mirror reflected my image. But it wasn't me anymore. In the glass, I saw myself standing in a dark room, surrounded by countless smaller mirrors, and I saw them begin to crack, to shatter, as if they wanted to trap me inside them, as if they wanted me to become a part of them. I tried to back away, but I couldn't escape the mirrors. The woman's shadow began to move closer. You will be mine, Claire. Her voice rang out, icy and defiant. And every choice you make is just another loop with no end. I felt a cold wave take over my body, and everything around me began to spin. The mirror shattered, a flash of light, and then everything collapsed into darkness. I didn't know how long I had been lying there, swallowed by complete darkness. It felt like I had fallen into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, a prison I couldn't escape. Images flickered in and out, faces flashed across my vision, only to dissolve back into shadow. The space around me spun wildly, pulling me deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. I felt like I was sinking into that very darkness. Fear drowned every thought, every breath caught in my throat. Maybe I was already dead, I thought. But when I tried to breathe, I could still feel the air. I was still alive. But what kind of life? Living like a soul, trapped between choices I couldn't change? I don't know when I managed to stand, but when I opened my eyes, I found myself in a vast room. 4 cold grey walls, no windows, no doors. Everything seemed poised to send me to a place from which there was no return. Yet something inside me refused to give in. No, I couldn't let go. Not like this. A voice echoed. Not the woman's voice I'd heard in the dark before, but someone else's. A voice I didn't recognize. It didn't come from a mouth, but from within me, as if my deepest thoughts had taken form. Claire, you've already made your choice. I turned around. No one was there. Not a single soul. You can't go back, the voice said again, clearer now, and laced with menace. You've stepped inside, and now it's time to face the price of choice. Choice? I whispered, confused, unsure what I was even saying. I just wanted to save them. I just wanted to save Jason and my mom. Yes, Claire, you wanted to save them, but no one can save anyone, except themselves. When I turned again, the room had changed. The grey walls were gone. In their place stood dozens of doors. Each door bore a different symbol, strange markings, as though each one represented a choice, a path, a future I could walk into. But there was one thing that trapped me. Every door demanded something in return. Behind each one was a soul, a life, or even me. I stepped toward the first door, then stopped. It bore a bizarre symbol, like the outline of a beast. I couldn't describe it, but something inside warned me. Opening that door would unleash something unimaginable. But if I didn't open it, I'd be trapped here forever, unable to escape. My steps faltered. "Choose, Claire." The voice now came from another door. A woman's voice, gentle, almost soothing. "Don't worry. Everything will pass. You just need to accept the truth." The truth. I didn't want to accept any more truths. I didn't want to believe that life and death were two inseparable halves, that some things could never be changed, that I was nothing more than a pawn on fate's chessboard. "You can't choose not to choose," Eli's voice called from yet another door. "You've gone too far, Claire. Everything you've done is the price for someone else's life. But that was your choice." I stood there, surrounded by doors, feeling like I was drifting in an endless ocean. The cold from the doors seemed to close in on me, forcing me to decide. The first door creaked open. Inside, I saw my mother sitting at the kitchen table, smiling at me. But when I looked closer, I realized she was sitting in a chair that only held part of her body. The rest of her was obscured, missing. A chill crept up my spine. She was incomplete. Something had been taken from her. The sight terrified me. Too much to step forward. The second door opened quietly. This time, I saw Jason, still lying in the hospital, but buried beneath rubble, as if he had died. I saw the pain in his eyes, pleading for help. But there was also something in that gaze that made it hard for me to breathe. And then, I turned to the other doors, the remaining choices. But I couldn't open another. I couldn't bear to see what lay behind them, because I knew if I opened another, I would lose everything. My hands trembled. All I could do was stand there, caught between choices I couldn't escape. "Claire," a voice whispered behind me. I turned and saw Eli. "What will you choose, Claire?" His gaze wrapped around me like a storm with no end. I looked into his eyes and realized something I couldn't explain. That look wasn't human. It belonged to someone, something that had lived too long, seen too much death, and grown far too comfortable with painful choices. I can't choose anymore," I gasped, the words stabbing into my chest. "I can't." "Then don't choose," Eli said, his voice low and cold. "That's the price, Claire. Don't choose." I don't know how long I stood there. I only knew that when the third door opened, I no longer had the strength to stay still. When I stepped through the door, I had no idea where I had entered. Everything vanished in a blink, and I felt as though I no longer belonged to this world. A pale light surrounded me, but it wasn't ordinary light. It was a cold, distant glow, not from the sun or electricity, but from another realm entirely. A place where day and night no longer existed. I didn't know where I was standing or where I was going. My head throbbed painfully. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I felt like I was falling into a bottomless abyss. And each time I tried to look up, the darkness pushed me further down. Eli's voice echoed again, this time not from afar, but right by my ear, soft yet commanding. "This is where all trapped souls end up." I turned around, but he wasn't there. The space around me was like a labyrinth with no exit, towering walls, no windows, no doors, and only that dim, hazy light filtering through small cracks. "You've already chosen, Claire," Eli continued, his voice void of sympathy. "There's no turning back." A chill spread through me. I looked around and realized I was in a strange place. It resembled an abandoned storage facility, but it wasn't a normal one. Odd objects surrounded me, vague shadows, scenes of ruin, frozen in place. The walls were cracked open, revealing deep fissures, so deep, it felt like entire worlds could hide within them. Suddenly, a door appeared in front of me. It wasn't like any other door. It was made of aged, splintered wood, scarred by time. There was no doorknob, only a shallow indentation in the center. I stepped closer, drawn by a strange calling. With each step, time seemed to slow, like something was stretching the seconds as I approached. I reached out, and the moment my hand touched the door, a jolt of electricity surged through my body. A wave of cold rushed from my palm, making me shiver. I tried to pull my hand back, but I couldn't. The door creaked open. Inside was a pitch-black space filled with shifting shadows. A blurry figure began to emerge. Jason. My younger brother stood there, as if waiting for me. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't really him. It was a distorted version of Jason. Something hollow, as if it was being controlled by an unseen force. I called his name, but there was no reply. The figure remained still, unmoving. I stepped closer, reached out, and placed my hand on his shoulder. His body was ice cold, lifeless. A heavy weight pressed down on me. Each step I took in this place felt dragged down by an invisible force. I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. "You've arrived." A woman's voice spoke from behind me. This time not Eli, but the same woman I had encountered in the darkness. I turned around and faced her. She was no longer a vague silhouette. She had become solid, pale skin, hollow eyes. She smiled faintly, but there was no emotion behind it. "Do you want to save him?" she asked. But there was no hope in her tone. "He's not here anymore. He no longer belongs to this world." "I don't believe that. I have to save him," I shouted, my voice trembling with resolve. You can't save anyone anymore. You've already chosen." My heart clenched. Her words were like a curse, but I couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept that my brother was lost. Couldn't accept that I had taken a path with no return. She stepped closer, her gaze empty, yet terrifying in its intensity. "You can't change fate, Claire. Death is inevitable. It was always meant to be." I felt myself sinking into a darkness with no way out. I couldn't accept the truth. But the more I ran, the deeper I was pulled into this world. Suddenly, a loud sound rang out, sharp, jarring, like something crashing into reality, yanking me from the daze. A scream echoed through the void. Claire. Claire. Jason. His name rang in my mind. But this time, it wasn't just a call. It was a plea. Desperate, frantic. I turned around, and in that moment, I saw a faint figure in the shadows. It was Jason again, but not like before. This time, he looked like a soul searching for a way out. "Help me, Claire," he whispered. I couldn't just stand there. I ran toward him, but the darkness clung to my legs, pulling me back. Every step became heavier, as if something unseen was trying to stop me. The world around me began to spin, and I felt myself collapsing. "Claire, you've gone too far." Eli's voice came from all directions, like a final warning. The cold surged through me once more. But this time, I couldn't stop. I had to save my brother. no matter what I had to face. I couldn't give up. Story 2. The Condemnation from the Shadows. I can't quite remember the last time I spoke with Jake. It's been a few years, I think. Everything has become hazy, like long days slipping away in memory, leaving behind only scattered fragments of time. But one evening, as I sat in the living room, staring blankly at my computer screen, like I was searching for some kind of escape, I received a message. Watch this. Don't disappoint me. This video will change everything. Jake, an old friend, someone I once considered a brother during our college days, had sent me a video. Its title immediately gave me an uneasy feeling. Do not watch alone. Curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't resist. Even though it was a clear warning, I decided to open the video anyway. I figured it was probably just some prank. Besides, I felt like I had nothing left to lose. The video began. The first scene showed an empty space, lit only by the faint glow of street lights filtering through the windows. An old table, covered in dust, stood silently in the darkness. A soundtrack played, hazy and dreamlike, an old, gentle, yet ominous melody. I looked closer, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just a black and white video. Nothing particularly noteworthy. But then I noticed something strange. In the upper left corner of the screen, there was a faint figure. Someone standing just outside the edge of the light. I didn't know where it came from, but the silhouette looked familiar. So familiar that I couldn't shake the creeping sense of dread. I tried to stop the video, but for some reason, it kept playing on its own. The footage shifted to a different scene. This time, an old decaying house with peeling walls and cracked windows. And then, I saw a face. That face made my heart stop. It was someone I could never forget. Mary, my ex-girlfriend, the one I had hurt so deeply in my youth. I had broken my promise to her, abandoned her when she needed me most. The images of Mary kept appearing in the video, emerging from the shadows I had never wanted to revisit. A growing unease spread through my body. I tried again to shut off the video, but it wouldn't stop. Everything inside me felt scrambled, and the footage just kept going. Each scene was a memory I had buried long ago. Times I betrayed my friends, moments I hurt the people I loved. Every image, every second felt like someone was slowly choking me with the weight of my past sins. I didn't know what to do. I tried to breathe, tried to stay calm, but the more I looked at the screen, the more the horror took hold. The scenes began to shift. First Mary, then Jake, the friend I had abandoned in a fit of senseless rage. Those moments repeated like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I wanted to escape the video, but it felt like a curse I couldn't outrun. Suddenly, the screen cut to a new scene. This time, I saw myself. A shot of me standing in a dimly lit room, illuminated only by a faint desk lamp. I looked into the mirror and saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. It was someone else. A version of myself I couldn't recognize. Standing there and smiling. That smile was cold and terrifying. Like a challenge. In that moment, I realized something horrifying. This video wasn't just a recording. It was a warning. It was playing back all my mistakes, the guilt I had hidden deep within my memory. And now, I couldn't run. Every image felt like a sentence, every scene a dagger, straight to my heart. I stared at the screen, and just then, I heard a faint sound, like someone breathing. I turned to look around. but the room was still and silent. Yet that strange feeling lingered, like someone was watching my every move. My lips were dry, but I couldn't stop. I tried once more to shut off the video, but nothing changed. Then, the images became clearer. The people I had hurt began to appear in the video, staring at me with eyes full of anger and sorrow. I couldn't take it anymore. At that moment, I began to feel the presence of something otherworldly, manipulating the video. A powerful, inexplicable force controlling me, forcing me to confront the past I had always tried to escape. And when I looked into the mirror again, I saw something that froze me in place. The figure staring back wasn't me. It was someone else. Someone who had died long ago. Someone I had hurt during a drunken night. Someone I had left to suffer without a shred of remorse. The video kept playing, and I couldn't turn it off. It had consumed me, and I understood finally that I would never be free of it. This was no joke. This video wasn't just some ordinary footage. It was a dangerous game I had unknowingly joined, and now I was trapped in it, unable to stop. Since the moment the video began, I haven't been able to escape. Every passing second felt like I was being pulled into an endless spiral, as if some invisible force was dragging me into the sins of my past. No matter how many times I tried to turn off the screen, delete the video, or even shut down the computer, nothing worked. The video kept reappearing, like a curse I couldn't shake off. But the strange thing was, it didn't just stop at showing my past sins. Something had changed. The video no longer just replayed old images. It began to show terrifying scenes. Things I had never seen before. These weren't memories. They were something else entirely. Visions of places and events I had never experienced. One evening, as I stared into the screen, the video suddenly shifted to a new scene. A strange house. Not one I had ever lived in, but a dark, cold structure buried deep in a desolate forest. Its windows were shattered, wooden doors rotting, and an eerie silence permeated the air. Inside that house, behind the cracked window pane, stood a shadowy figure. I couldn't make out the face, but the silhouette felt familiar. It stared at me with haunting eyes, as if it was waiting for something. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were locked onto the screen. Then the video changed again. This time, it showed a dark road shrouded in thick fog. I recognized it immediately. It was the road I had driven down during a stormy night. The night of my accident. But strangely, I wasn't there. Instead, there was a man standing with his back to me, staring into the darkness. Suddenly, a woman's scream pierced through the fog. My whole body trembled. I wanted to shut the video off, but it was like my hands had been nailed to the seat. I couldn't move. The scream echoed in my ears, pulling me into a bottomless void. When the scream finally ceased, I found myself in a completely different place. A dark forest. Shadowy figures floated around me, blurry like specters. I could feel their presence but couldn't see them clearly. They were close, very close. A chilling cold crept through my body, and then I realized the truth I had tried so hard to avoid. Those shadows were the souls I had wronged in the past. Not just people I had hurt, but spirits that had never left me. They had been following me, waiting for the moment I would pay for what I had done. The fear turned into despair. I wanted to run, to escape these ghosts, but my legs refused to move. I could only stand there, staring at the screen like prey awaiting the inevitable end. Suddenly, laughter echoed from the video. A cold, mocking laugh. Then a man stepped into the frame. He was dressed in black, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His figure was hazy, like an illusion. But I knew, deep down I knew, it was him. Jake, the one who had sent me the video. He stared at me with eyes devoid of empathy. "You think you can run forever?" he said, his voice echoing inside my skull. "Everything you've done, every sin you've committed, will never leave you. And now, it's time to pay." The space around me darkened. The spirits became more defined. They started moving closer. A woman with a disfigured face. A man with furious eyes. They all stood before me, staring as if waiting for me to kneel and beg for forgiveness. "Jake," I screamed in despair. "Jake, please, stop this. I can't take it anymore." But his laughter only grew louder, as if he was savoring my torment. "You're too late. It's already begun, and it won't stop. It'll only end when you're completely consumed by your own past." The pain in my head spread like wildfire. The images in the video were no longer just memories. They had become living nightmares, scenes I couldn't escape. Each one more horrifying than the last, pulling me deeper into a bottomless pit. My vision blurred, my mind spun out of control, and I could no longer speak. The video kept playing, endlessly, and I felt myself being dragged into a vortex I could never break free from. The world around me faded, becoming more and more distant. But one thing I knew for certain: the souls in the video were trying to pull me into eternal darkness. As the video kept playing, I felt myself being pulled into an abyss I couldn't escape. The whole world seemed to blur into inexplicable images, and the ghosts still stood around me, staring with eyes full of hostility, but I couldn't move, couldn't say a word. I could only watch as they stepped closer, one by one. A dreadful sensation enveloped me, as if these souls didn't just want me to pay for what I had done. They wanted me to feel the endless torment they had endured. These were not the harmless spirits from stories I'd heard, but entities trapped in eternal suffering. Suddenly, the screen brightened, and I saw myself appear in the video again. This time, I was standing in a completely different room. A filthy space, filled with garbage and a heavy, musty stench. The walls were cracked and moldy, and the dim flicker of a dying light bulb only made the atmosphere more grotesque. I looked around, and in the corner of the room, I recognized a familiar figure, Jake. But it wasn't the Jake I once knew. He looked different now. His hair was disheveled, his eyes hollow, as if life had been drained from him. He stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite define. Resentment, maybe regret. But I knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the friend I used to know. "This video, it's not a coincidence," Jake spoke, his voice deep and echoing through the silence of the room. "You can't escape. What you're seeing isn't just your past. It's a curse." His words rang like a bell in my mind. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. A chilling cold spread through my body, and I could feel a presence, something tightening its grip around me, giving me no chance to break free. Jake stepped closer, each of his steps pulling me toward an unchangeable fate. "You think you can keep living like this, ignoring the sins you've committed?" he asked, eyes fixed on me. "You've hurt too many people for too long. The price you pay is to endure what you've caused." I wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but my lips were frozen. My body had no strength left. All I could do was watch the ghosts in the video draw nearer, their eyes clinging to me, piercing into my mind. Stop running, Jake said, his gaze turning ice cold. Because you can't? Outside the room, I heard footsteps. Not mine or Jake's, but someone else's. A large, shadowy figure entered the hazy space. As I looked closer, I realized it was one of the spirits I had seen in the previous video. A man with a deformed face and a body charred by flames. He stood there, staring at me with hatred, as if he embodied all those I had harmed. There's no escape, the man said, his voice a rasp from the depths of hell. My whole body turned to stone. My eyes couldn't turn away from that horrific sight. The spirits around me were no longer mere memories. They were souls who had died because of me. People I had abandoned, betrayed, or wounded in the past. A new scene began. This time, I saw myself standing in a forest with no way out. The trees around me were charred black, and I could feel the heat. Something was draining the life from me. Strange sounds echoed from afar, as if something was waiting for me in the darkness. I tried to run, but my legs were heavy, as if nailed to the ground. Then, in the shadows, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me. It was a strange creature, perhaps not human, not a ghost. It stepped toward me slowly, as if playing with my fear. It laughed, a long, terrifying laugh, as if all the pain I had caused was now being unleashed. My vision blurred, but I couldn't look away. I could feel it drawing near, in a way I couldn't comprehend, and death was waiting for me. The ghosts, the spirits surrounding me. There was no way out. I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't just trapped in the video. I was trapped in my own sins. The laughter grew louder, and I realized something horrifying. The video wasn't just a form of torture. It was a permanent curse, a never-ending loop, and I was the only one who could never escape it. Story 3. My old friend from the netherworld. Michael's entire life, from when he was just a boy until adulthood, had been intertwined with one person, Nick. The two of them had shared countless beautiful memories throughout their high school years. From playful games in the park to late-night talks about the future, they had always been side by side. But then, like a breeze passing through, Nick suddenly vanished from Michael's life. No goodbyes, no messages, just a suffocating silence, as if Nick had been swallowed by some world from which there was no return. Michael never forgot his friend. Still, after graduating college and starting a job at a media company in New York, his memories of Nick gradually faded. But the dreams that began to haunt Michael, those he could never forget. Every night, as sleep took hold, Michael found himself in a familiar place. It was a quiet forest, with winding trails blanketed by fallen leaves, and there, someone always waited for him. Nick. His old friend looked the same as ever, black hair, shining eyes, and that warm smile. But there was something strange. Nick always stood at a distance, never stepping closer. He would only call out Michael's name in the wind, his voice urgent. "You have to go there, Michael. You have to go where we promised." Michael would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding with unease. Every time he opened his eyes, he felt a powerful pull, like some unseen force was dragging him towards something he couldn't understand. The dreams weren't just terrifying, they were paralyzing. He couldn't resist them, couldn't refuse their call. The next morning, exhausted but determined, Michael decided to search for answers. He started looking up the places he and Nick used to talk about in their younger days. But there was one place from the dream he couldn't quite remember. A place Nick always told him to go. All he had was a strange compulsion, a vague fear that made it feel inevitable. Eventually, after days of searching, he stumbled upon a clue. An abandoned house in a remote suburb, about a 2-hour drive from New York. It was an old house, long deserted, with rotting walls and tightly shut doors. Without hesitation, Michael set out. Everything felt like the dream. Each step, each turn, uncannily familiar. When Michael arrived, he couldn't believe his eyes. The house was exactly as he had seen in his dreams. Though it had clearly been uninhabited for years, the air around it felt strange, as if the house still clung to some lingering soul. He paused, looking around. The wind howled, making the window panes creak. As if calling him inside, a chill spread through Michael's body, but he pushed forward, stepping through the front door. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was a strange familiarity to it all. Then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, as though someone were moving in the shadows. His heart pounded, his head spinning. "Nick?" Michael called softly, but there was no reply. He walked through long hallways, every step echoing like the whispers of ghosts from the past. Then, in a small room, a strange beam of light from a wall-mounted lamp illuminated an old painting. Michael froze, staring at it. It was Nick, but not the smiling Nick he once knew. This Nick looked as though he were crying out for help, eyes filled with terror and pain. It wasn't the Nick from his memories. It was someone else, a trapped soul. Suddenly, a cold wind swept past, and Michael heard a whisper, not from afar, but right beside him. "Michael, you have to help me. We didn't finish our promise. I can't move on without you." Michael turned, and suddenly, there was Nick. Not in a dream, but right there in front of him, cloaked in a haze of mist. But what terrified him was that this wasn't the friend he once cherished. Nick's body was ghostly, half-transparent, his eyes empty and heavy with guilt. "Nick," Michael gasped, but no more words came out. Nick looked at him with sorrowful eyes and quietly said, "If you don't continue this journey, I'll drag you into this world forever." The room darkened, and the whispers grew louder and clearer. Michael knew then it wasn't just Nick. There were other souls waiting. He couldn't turn back. The journey he and Nick had started years ago wasn't over, and now it had pulled him into a game with no way out. Michael could never forget the image of Nick in that dark room. The blurry figure of his old friend, eyes void of light, filled with pain and guilt, haunted him every night. Every time he closed his eyes, it felt as though Nick was standing right beside him, whispering pleas that he couldn't bring himself to refuse. Since that night, Michael had been unable to return to his normal life. Work, friends, everything around him seemed meaningless. The sensation of being pulled into a world he couldn't understand. A place where Nick's soul waited for release, consumed him every second. The dream he had last night was only the beginning of an unavoidable chain of events. He began researching the abandoned house and the stories surrounding it. From what he discovered, the house didn't just hold secrets about Nick. It had a dark history. Before it was abandoned, it had once been home to a strange family, rumored to perform occult rituals on moonless nights. Whispers of restless spirits and bizarre phenomena around the house drew many curious visitors, but none could explain what they had witnessed. Michael couldn't deny what he had experienced, but part of him still wanted to turn away, to go back to a normal life untouched by ghosts. Yet every night, in his dreams, Nick returned. Not once, but over and over again. And this time, Nick no longer stood at a distance. He came closer, and in his eyes was no longer guilt, but despair. "Michael, you can't leave me. I can't move on unless you help me finish the journey we started," Nick said. His voice cold, like a chilling breeze, echoing in Michael's ears. "We promised to go there. You have to come." Each time the dream ended, Michael woke up, exhausted and drained. But this time, when he looked at the clock beside his bed, something strange happened. It wasn't just the overwhelming urge. There was a note on the clock. A note he couldn't explain. "Don't let us fail. I'll always be with you." A chill swept over him. Michael knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was a warning. He couldn't keep running. He had to find answers. Michael decided to return to the abandoned house, the place where everything had started, the place where Nick's soul was still waiting. But this time, he wouldn't go alone. As he stepped out of the house, a memory struck him. Nick wasn't the only one capable of reaching him. The rumors he had heard about the house, about other spirits, weren't just urban legends. There were ghosts that didn't want to move on. Spirits searching for others with similar fates to continue their journey. And Nick, with his relentless pleas, was one of them. When he arrived at the house, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. The air felt thick, making each of Michael's steps harder. The beam of his car's headlights cutting through the darkness felt like an intrusion into the realm of lingering souls. He looked toward the window of the house and saw, in the shadows, a faint figure moving, as if it had been waiting for him. Michael couldn't give up. He stepped forward, heart tightening, but as he entered the house, it wasn't the same eerie silence as before. This time, there were sounds. Footsteps echoed from the hallways, but when he turned around, there was no one. It was as if the spirits were quietly watching. As he ventured deeper into the house, he felt a strange presence. The windows were all shut, yet shadows seemed to glide across them, as though someone was tracking his every move. He reached the living room, where he had once seen the painting of Nick. But now, it wasn't the same. The painting was still of Nick, but in a twisted state. His eyes were hollow. His lips moved silently, without sound. The features of his face were stretched and distorted, shrouded in something dark. Michael couldn't keep looking at it. There was an urgent pull from behind him. "Michael?" A cold voice echoed from within the room. "You've come. But not alone, have you?" Michael turned around and saw her. A woman. Another spirit. She stood there, in a long white dress, her hair falling like strands of spider silk. Her eyes were no longer human. They were black voids. "You will help us, won't you? It's time to fulfill the promise." Her voice pierced into Michael's mind, making him feel like he was being drawn into another world. Michael couldn't speak. He knew this was no longer just a dream. This was real, and he couldn't escape. Michael felt a tight knot in his chest as he faced the strange woman standing before him. She was clearly not among the living. It was evident in the way she stood motionless, her hollow eyes devoid of any soul. Unlike Nick, the spirit of his old friend, this woman exuded an unbearable coldness, as though she had drained every ounce of warmth around her, leaving only pure death in her wake. Her voice echoed in the darkened house, like a whisper that could never be silenced. You think you can deny us? Michael, you came too late. The door has opened and you can't turn back now. Michael tried to move, but his legs felt nailed to the ground. A sickening sensation spread through his body, like layers of his skin were being lifted, exposing a helpless, uncontrollable shiver. He wanted to run, to escape, but some invisible force pulled him closer to her, closer still. She stepped forward, each of her movements staring through space, leaving behind a foul, unearthly stench. Michael looked into her deep, lifeless eyes. No light, no trace of life. I know you can't escape, she whispered. We're all trapped in this loop, an endless loop. You will become one of us. You cannot leave. Panic surged in Michael's chest, like he was drowning in a black river from which there was no escape. Just as she reached out to touch his shoulder, a strong gust of wind blew through the room, pushing her back and distorting the spirits around the house like warped paintings. Michael stepped backward, unsure where to go. The house before him had transformed into a labyrinth with no exit. Every room, every hallway seemed to twist into one another, endlessly. He heard footsteps again behind him, not hers, but from other spirits, ones who had once lived here. A strange noise came from a nearby room, drawing Michael in with irresistible curiosity. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the sound, unaware it was the trap the spirits had set for him. When he opened the door, the sight nearly made him faint. On the dusty, faded floor stood an old wooden table, covered in a thick layer of dust, scattered with worn black and white photographs. The faces in the pictures were unrecognizable to Michael, except for one, Nick, in the corner of the room. A rocking chair swayed gently, as if someone had just been sitting there, waiting. Michael approached, his heart pounding in his chest. He placed his hand on the back of the chair and turned toward the mirror on the wall. There, he saw a faint reflection of a woman's face. A chill shot through his body as the face became clearer, a twisted smile forming on her lips, her hollow eyes seeming to see everything that Michael was about to endure. Michael? A voice called from behind. He turned, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Nick stood there, but not as a fleeting dream or phantom. This was real. He stood in the shadows, his eyes no longer filled with the warmth of an old friend, but cold and heavy with guilt. You can't run, Nick said softly, yet with a haunting weight. We promised we would finish this journey. But now, you've come back too late. A wave of numbness washed over Michael. He didn't understand what was happening, couldn't comprehend how things had come to this. But one thing was certain. He had been pulled into a world beyond his control. A world of restless spirits. Nick stepped closer, and with every step, the darkness seemed to thicken, as if he were pulling the entire space into his realm. Michael wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. He felt himself dissolving into that darkness, losing grip on reality. How can I help you, Nick? Michael whispered through gritted teeth, fists clenched, trying to stay grounded. You're dead. Why do you keep following me, trying to drag me into this world? Nick looked at him, his eyes full of sorrow and regret. You don't understand. I don't want to drag you down, Michael. I'm just a part of this place now. And you will be too. As those words echoed, the room fell into darkness. It was no longer the same dusty old room he had entered. The painting, the table, the chair, they were gone, replaced by a space devoid of direction, where darkness itself had no boundaries. Suddenly, the whispers of spirits filled the air, not from outside, but from within Michael's own head. Run, if you can. But Michael no longer had the strength. From the shadows, blurry figures emerged, and he knew he had fallen into a world with no escape. Story 4. The Apartment of the Dead. I moved into apartment 4B at the Fremont View Complex on a rainy October afternoon. The wind rustled through the brittle maple trees, groaning like a chorus of mourners. Seattle was damp, dull, and overcast this time of year. Just like the apartment I had rented for a shockingly low price. Only $700 a month for nearly 700 square feet, including utilities. My name is Michael Ross, 31 years old. I work as a sound editor for a documentary production company. I'm not the kind of person who gets easily spooked by ghost stories, but I also can't say I'm completely immune to the unexplainable. The apartment smelled faintly of mildew the first time I stepped inside. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot. The white painted walls were peeling in patches, and the bathroom was tucked away at the end of a long hallway where sunlight never quite reached. The previous tenant, a man named Howard Crane, had died in this apartment. I learned that from a whisper by the leasing agent, a platinum-haired woman with deep blue eyes and a voice as light as mist. She told me he'd taken his own life in the bathroom at 2 a.m. on a winter night last year. I didn't care. The city was expensive, and I needed a quiet place to work. People die everywhere, right? But I was wrong. So very wrong. I woke up at 2:03 a.m. to the sound of running water. Clear as day, unmistakable. Like someone had just turned on the shower. I lay frozen, heart pounding in my chest. Not out of fear, but because I knew for certain. I hadn't touched the faucets that night. I hadn't showered. I hadn't even washed my face. And I lived alone. The water ran for nearly a minute, then abruptly stopped. Then came the sound of slippers. Slap, slap, slap. It came from the bathroom, echoing down the hallway toward my bedroom. I sat up, heart racing. No one was there. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I stepped out trembling and turned on the light. Nothing, no water, no wet footprints. I blamed exhaustion, moving stress. But the second night, it happened again. Exactly at 2:03 a.m. On the third night, I decided to stay awake. I sat in the living room, dim yellow light casting shadows on the stained, cracked walls. I set up my recorder right outside the bedroom door. 1:58 a.m. Nothing. 2 came. A faint noise, like someone slowly pulling open a wooden door. 2:03 a.m. The water turned on. I stood up, heart thundering, and slowly approached the bathroom. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open. No one inside. But the recorder had captured something horrifying. A whisper, very faint, very close to the mic. "Why are you in my house?" I dropped the device. My whole body went cold. I went to the building manager's office and asked about Howard. They brushed me off, said the case was closed. A depression-induced suicide. Nothing suspicious. I didn't believe them. A man found hanged in the bathtub, but the bathroom door had been locked from the outside. That had never been explained. An old woman named Margaret, who lived downstairs, stopped me as I was leaving. She whispered, "I hear him every night since he died. You shouldn't stay there long." She handed me an old yellowed envelope with no return address. The handwriting was messy. "If anyone finds this letter, please understand, I did not kill myself. I'm being kept here. Something lives in this apartment, and it won't let anyone leave." The letter was signed, Howard Crane. That night, I searched the apartment. Beneath the old carpet in the bedroom, I found a metal trapdoor, an access hatch to a sub-basement. I opened it. A small room, barely big enough for someone to crouch inside. The smell of mold, dead rodents, and something foul, like rotting meat. In the corner sat an old rusted iron bathtub. No pipes, no drainage, no plumbing at all. But when I touched the rim, it was soaking wet, and water began to drip from a faucet that didn't exist. 3:01 a.m. I received a call from an unknown number, area code 206, Seattle. I answered. No one spoke. Just the sound of running water, and then a man's whisper. I never left. I screamed and threw the phone at the wall, but the screen stayed lit. One final message blinked across it. 4B. No one leaves. I haven't moved out. I don't know why. Every night, I still hear the footsteps, still see a shadow flicker across the bathroom mirror, though no one stands behind me. And last night, I saw something else. A handprint, faint, pressed against the mirror, written in dripping water. You're next. I began marking each night. I woke up in a small leather notebook. Under the dim yellow glow of the bedside lamp, the scribbled letters looked like they were written by a madman. But I had to record everything, because I felt my memory slowly slipping away piece by piece. I wasn't sure anymore whether I had locked the door or if I had actually heard that voice. But one thing I knew for certain: this apartment was changing me. I woke to the sound of knocking. Not a soft knock, but a dry, rhythmic knock, 3 times. And then silence. I listened. 3 more knocks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The sound was coming from inside the bathroom. I jumped up, turned on the light, and moved toward the door, only to find it already open. The room was pitch black, and in the mirror, I saw the shadow of a man standing behind me. I turned around. No one. But the mirror began to fog up, though the shower wasn't running. Slowly, letters appeared on the glass, as if scratched by fingernails. I warned you. The next morning, I decided to visit old Mrs. Margaret, the only person in the building who didn't look at me with indifference or fear. Her apartment was on the 1st floor. I knocked. It took nearly 5 minutes before she opened the door. Her face looked more sunken than the last time I saw her. Her eyes were darkened with rings, and I noticed a long scratch on the back of her right hand, as if something with claws had gouged her. "You shouldn't have come," she said as soon as she saw me. "It doesn't like being questioned." I asked what it was, but she shook her head and let me in. Inside, the air was thick with incense, and bunches of dried garlic hung from the windows. Margaret told me, apartment 4B isn't new to death. Before Howard, there was a girl named Elsie. Before her, a man named Walt. And before that, a family of 4. Anyone who stays longer than 33 days either dies or goes mad. I had been there 19 days. She handed me an old tin box tied shut with red cloth. Inside was a bundle of yellowed papers, a small journal, and a name tag, A. Day, caretaker. "The keeper of the room," she said. "Each generation has one chosen to keep the demon asleep, but since Deer vanished, no one has taken his place. And now, it's hungry. I read the journal all night. Deer's handwriting was sharp, as if scribbled in the dark in a hurry. Apartment 4B is not a residence, it's a gateway. There's a space overlapping ours, a layer between brick and wall, where it hides. I call it the hollow. The longer one stays, the easier it is to be pulled into the hollow. First come the sounds, then the visions, then lost time, lost awareness, lost self. When the mirror begins to write, it's already too late. I close the journal, heart pounding like a drum. I had already seen the writing in the mirror. I don't remember exactly what happened next. I only know I woke up on the bathroom floor, freezing, my head throbbing where it had slammed against the wall. Above me, part of the ceiling plaster had crumbled away, revealing concrete underneath. And beneath that, a hole just large enough for a person to crawl through. I didn't make that hole. I was sure. And when I pointed my flashlight up, my eyes met another man's. Deep sunken sockets, skin waxy pale, lips a dark purplish hue. He stared straight at me, unblinking. I screamed and scrambled back. But when I shone the light again, nothing. Just an endless void. But that night, I lost 4 hours. I checked my phone. I thought it was only 2:15 a.m., but the clock said 6:10 a.m. I had no memory of what I did during that time. I decided to track down Howard Crane's surviving relatives, hoping they could tell me what really happened before his death. I found his younger brother, Joel Crane, who lived 2 hours outside Seattle. Joel met me at a roadside café, looking gaunt and avoiding the sunlight like someone with a skin disease. I haven't gone near that building since Howard died, Joel said. He started saying strange things, claimed someone was living in the mirror, said the walls were pulling him in. We thought he was delusional. But then, I saw him disappear on the security footage. Not like walked away, disappear. He dissolved, layer by layer, like he was ripped out of reality. Joel showed me a copy of the video, grainy and black and white, but I saw it clearly. Howard stood in front of the mirror. Then suddenly, his hand sank into the mirror, like it was liquid. He turned toward the camera, mouth wide open in a silent scream. Then, he was yanked inside. No blood, no shattered glass, just a blank mirror and a shadow passing across it. I drove home in the rain. Only one sentence echoed in my mind. I warned you. I looked into the bathroom mirror. This time, I didn't see myself. I saw Howard. He stood in a long hallway lined with damp, moldy tiles. His eyes were bloodshot. His mouth moved silently. Then he raised his hand and pointed straight at me. The mirror cracked open, and from the fissure, a cold hand reached out. I used to think death was the end, a final period closing all struggles and pain. But now, after 23 days living in apartment 4B, I know one thing for certain. Sometimes, death is just a door, and the most horrifying thing lies behind it. Since the night I saw Howard in the mirror and that twisted hand reached out, I haven't been the same. I don't sleep. I don't eat. Time passes like a film randomly spliced together. There are moments when I'm standing in the living room, then in a blink, I find myself in the bathtub, water spilling over, clothes soaked. No one can explain it, not even me. And in those rare moments of clarity, I decided I had to go down to the hollow. I returned to the bedroom where the metal floor hatch I had opened back in the first chapter was. Below it was the crawl space, cramped and reeking of old death. But tonight, when I shined my flashlight down, what I saw was no longer a rusted tub. It was a stone hallway, narrow and dark, like the open jaws of some living creature. I don't remember climbing down. All I know is when I came to, I was standing in the middle of that hallway. The walls were damp, like congealed blood. Somewhere in the distance, the drip of water echoed like a warning, and at the end of the hall, a rotten wooden door carved in Latin, Custos ad mortem, the keeper of death. I pushed the door open. The space inside shouldn't have existed underground. It was vast like an abandoned cathedral, with a ceiling shrouded in pitch-black shadows. Lining the walls were hundreds of mirrors. Old, cracked bathroom mirrors, vanity mirrors. But they all had one thing in common. They didn't reflect me. Each mirror showed someone else. Someone screaming. Someone being strangled. Someone being dragged across the floor by something formless and unknown. I approached a round mirror covered in a dusty haze. As I wiped it clean, I saw Margaret. She was tied to a chair in her own apartment, eyes bulging, mouth agape, blood pouring from her ears and nose. I stumbled backward in horror. This was happening, not a memory, not a hallucination. I called her name. No sound came out, but I was certain she felt me. She turned her head, looking straight into my eyes through the mirror, and mouthed silently, "Run." I left the mirror room and went deeper. At the end of the hallway was a small chamber, its walls covered in faded moss-green wallpaper. On the table sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. I pressed play, a crackle, then the sobbing of a woman. "My name is Elsie. If someone finds this tape, I've been here 31 days. I don't remember my name anymore." The mirrors started smiling at me. I saw myself die and come back. They said I'm next. Burn the apartment. Burn it. I shivered. The second tape was a man's voice. "I'm Walt." I saw a door pulled through the wall. Not dead, torn apart, like a glitch. "If you're hearing this, you're just like me, and it's watching you." I turned off the machine. That's when I realized the room had no door. I began to hear giggling, echoing like it came from within my own empty chest. And then I found myself back in apartment 4B, but it was different. The sofa was shredded, the walls smeared with dried blood, and from the ceiling above hung Howard, suspended, eyes staring straight at me. "You can't leave this place anymore," he said, his voice resonating from every direction. "The apartment doesn't just hold souls, it devours memories. Slowly, you'll forget your name, forget why you came, forget who you are. And then, you will be the one to open the door for the next." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out. As I ran, I slipped and fell into a deep pit where I thought I would die. But I landed on a moldy mattress, and before me was a room filled with papers, maps, and strange occult symbols. In the center sat a dried-up corpse, leaning against the wall, clutching a book tightly in its arms. Doer. I saw the name tag on the floor. He had died here, trapped in the very place he once guarded. On the last page of the book, there was only one line: "The keeper cannot leave." And beneath it, a blank page waiting for the next name to be written. I woke up on the floor of apartment 4B, my head pounding like it had been split open. The room was quiet, clean, no cracked mirrors, no dripping water, no trace of anything. I thought it had all been a dream, but when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw Dor, slumped over his desk, eyes dried and hollow. I saw Margaret, hanging from a phone cord in her living room. I saw Joel, Howard's brother, holding a trembling gun at the door of apartment 4B. And I saw myself, smiling, a smile that didn't belong to me. My eyes were empty, and my hand was opening the door to welcome a new tenant who had just knocked. Story 5. The Haunting Returns. My name is Meredith. I live in a small suburban town in Oregon where the morning fog often falls thick and the pine forest behind my house makes strange noises when night comes. My husband Eric died 7 years ago in a car accident. They said he died instantly. His neck snapped, the car caught fire, and there was no chance of survival. I used to think I had moved past the pain. I used to think so. But then, a year after Eric's death, I started seeing strange things. At first, it was just vague sensations. The sound of soft footsteps on the wooden floor in the middle of the night. His old shirt mysteriously reappearing in the closet, even though I was certain I had thrown it out. I tried to comfort myself, telling myself it was just grief, hallucinations born from longing. But then, I started seeing him. The first time was through the large mirror in the living room. I was dusting the mantelpiece when I happened to glance into the mirror. And there, reflected behind me, was Eric. There was no mistaking it. He was wearing the grey wool coat I had given him for Christmas during our last year together. His face was solemn, eyes locked on mine. Unblinking, I whipped around. No one was there. But when I turned back to the mirror, he was still there. Closer this time. Far too close. As if just inches away. I screamed, knocking a vase off the table. From that day on, Eric's image began appearing more often. Sometimes he stood in the hallway, watching me from the shadows. Other times I saw him walk past my bedroom door while I was reading. And it seemed that, as time went on, he became more and more real. I tried telling Linda, my sister, but she just looked at me with pity. "You're depressed, Meredith. You need to see someone." But no doctor could explain why I felt a freezing breath on the back of my neck each night. No one could make sense of the handprints on the inside of the window glass, or why Eric's cologne still lingered in the bedroom when I woke up at 3 a.m. One night, half asleep, I felt a cold hand touch my cheek. I opened my eyes. Eric was lying beside me. I couldn't breathe. His face was pale as bone, his eyes black like bottomless pits. He said nothing, just stared, unblinking. I shut my eyes tight, repeating in my head, "This is a dream. This is a dream. This is a dream." But when I opened them again, he was still there, and he smiled. That smile wasn't Eric's. That was when I began to suspect. The thing wearing my husband's face was no longer him. I went to Pastor David at the church near town. He was the one who had performed Eric's funeral service. When I told him what I'd been experiencing, he looked at me for a long time before gently saying, "Meredith, there are entities that don't belong to our world, but they know how to borrow memories, appearances, even voices to deceive us. They don't come out of love. They come to control." He gave me a vial of holy water and a rosary, instructing me to place it under my pillow and hang a crucifix over the front door. I followed his instructions, though my heart was still filled with doubt. That night, As I lay down in bed, the lights in the house began to flicker violently. The room grew cold, so cold I could see my breath curling in the air. And then, he appeared again, standing at the edge of the bed. Myrrh. His voice was deep and hoarse, like it rose from the bottom of a grave. Don't you love me anymore? I gripped the rosary tight, whispering prayers under my breath. I'm Eric, it said. I came back for you. I screamed, You're not Eric. Suddenly, its face contorted. Its eyes rolled back, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, almost to its ears, letting out a horrifying screech like wind howling through ancient tombs. The entire room shook. Light bulbs burst, the mirror cracked. I collapsed to the cold floor, unconscious. The next morning, I awoke among broken furniture, blood trickling down my forehead. I thought about leaving the house, selling it, getting far away. But just as I began gathering a few essentials to leave, there was a knock at the door. A woman stood on my porch. She looked to be in her 50s, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken and haunted. Are you Meredith? She asked. I nodded, wary. My name is Claire. I used to live here, before you. Her words sent a chill down my spine. You've seen him too, haven't you? Claire continued, her eyes red and wet with unshed tears. Claire stood on my doorstep as if she had traveled a great distance to get here. Not just in miles, but from somewhere deep and dark within her soul. She wore an old wool coat, clutching a worn leather handbag, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, as if afraid something was following her. I just need a few minutes, she said, her voice hoarse. There are things you need to know. Before it's too late. We sat in the living room. I made tea, my hands shaking so badly I spilled water onto the saucer. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, as if she didn't dare fully enter this space. Every time she glanced at the wall mirror, the very first one I ever saw Eric in, she would quickly avert her eyes. You used to live here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire nodded slowly. Back in 1984, my husband Ramon bought this house after we got married. I loved it when we first moved in. White walls, red roof tiles, a lavender garden in the backyard. But then, she paused, inhaling deeply, as if bracing herself. After Raymond died, I started seeing him. I thought it was just grief. I'd stay up all night by the window, hoping his familiar silhouette would return. And then one day, he did. Claire told me that Raymond began appearing precisely at 3:17 a.m., the hour folklore calls the devil's hour. At first, he only stood at the bedroom doorway, silently watching. But then, he began whispering to her in her sleep. The words started off gentle, but slowly turned strange, repetitive, like they were being controlled by some foreign consciousness. He started asking me to do strange things, Claire said, her voice cracking. Pour salt in every corner of the room. Keep the cat out of the house. Light candles through the night. I did it, thinking it would help him stay. But the more I did, the more he changed. Claire looked at me, her gaze vacant. Do you know what I found in the attic? I shook my head, my heartbeat quickening. A small altar. On it were strands of hair, old photographs, black candles, and a leather-bound book, written in a language I didn't understand. I didn't make it, Meredith. I'd never even been up there before. A chill ran down my spine. That attic, I'd never gone up there either. I'd almost forgotten it even existed, because since I moved in, The attic door had always been stuck shut. I called a priest for an exorcism. That day, Ramon didn't appear. But the next night, the living room mirror shattered for no reason. After that, everything got worse. Claire lowered her face, her voice barely a whisper. He wasn't Raymond anymore. He scratched the walls, leaving scorched claw marks. I saw him crawl along the ceiling, moving like a spider. One time, I woke up to find myself hanging upside down over the bed, with him staring at me from the ceiling, saying, "Why did you call God?" I gripped the teacup, my hands trembling violently. "And then?" I asked. "I ran," Claire said. "I left in the night, with nothing but a suitcase and 2 cats. I didn't dare sell the house. I didn't want anyone moving in. But then, 7 years later, I heard you had." After Claire left, I stood frozen in the upstairs hallway, staring at the attic door. I grabbed a ladder and reached for the stiff wooden latch. Dust and the scent of mold spilled down. I climbed up, flashlight in hand. The air inside was bone-chilling, even though it was the middle of summer outside. A thick layer of dust covered the floor, so dense that footprints were clearly visible. And at the center of the attic was a small table. Just as Claire had described, I walked closer. On the table sat a dark wooden box, carved with strange symbols. When I touched it, the box trembled. Something inside was moving. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode. I opened it. Inside was a bundle of black hair, long and soft, as if freshly cut, and an old yellowed photograph. The photo was of me and Eric, but something was off. In the picture, I was smiling, but Eric's face was blurred, smudged as though erased by an invisible hand. And beneath the photo was a sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "He is not your husband. He is learning to become him. When he finishes, you will no longer be yourself." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring into the mirror. Around 3 a.m., the room grew cold. The air seemed to freeze. The lights went out. And in the mirror, he appeared again. But this time, he no longer wore Eric's face. His face had elongated, the skin sagged and wrinkled. His mouth stretched grotesquely wide to the sides. His eyes were black voids, lifeless. He smiled at me, a smile that never ended. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. And then he said, "I'm almost finished. Thank you for letting me learn through love." I no longer remember how I got out of that room. All I know is that when my legs finally stopped, I was slumped under the back porch, drenched in sweat, still clutching the photo with Eric's blurred face. The ground was cold as stone, and the night sky was empty, no stars. I couldn't stay here another night, at least not alone. The next morning, I called Linda, even though she hadn't believed me before. The sound of my voice on the phone made her fall silent for a long moment before she finally said, "Where are you? I'm coming." 2 hours later, Linda arrived. She brought 2 suitcases, a silver crucifix hanging from her neck, and a look of deep worry, tinged with fear. Linda had always been the rational one, but after just one night, she believed me. Her phone lost signal the moment the sun went down. The digital wall clock began counting backward from 3:17 for no apparent reason. And worst of all, around midnight, as we sat in the living room, we both heard the sound of a piano playing from the basement. I don't own a piano. We ran downstairs. The lights flickered dimly. There was no piano, only a cold cement floor. a few old boxes, and a trail of dried blood stretching from the wall to the corner of the room. As I stepped closer, the sharp, metallic stench hit my nose, making me gag. Linda gripped my hand tightly. "We have to leave," she whispered. But I couldn't. Not when all the answers were still buried within the silent walls of this house. The next day, I went to the town library. There was an old section labeled Resident Records, archived on paper since the early 900s. I searched for the file on the house. 44 Maple Lane. The first line made me freeze. First owner, Douglas Marrow. Disappeared in 1952. Body never found. Marrow. The name sent a chill down my spine. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too familiar. I remembered the scribbled words on the photo from the attic. "He's learning to become him." I kept digging and found a newspaper article from 1952. Douglas Marrow, a single pianist, was reported missing from his home on Christmas Eve. Neighbors claimed to hear piano music playing for 3 days after, though he was never seen. When police broke in, they found only a half-burnt piano and a pool of unidentified blood. I closed the book. My whole body went cold. The piano, the blood. A man erased from reality. It all began here. On the way home, I stopped by a small rundown shop I had always ignored. A shabby old bookstore called Elias's Curiosities. The wooden sign was faded, as if it had hung there for a century. Inside was the scent of old paper, leather, and an elderly man polishing a pocket watch with trembling hands. "How can I help you?" He looked up, eyes sunken, behind thick glasses. I'm looking into Douglas Marrow. Do you know him?" The old man's face froze for a few seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "I knew him, and I knew the thing that came with him." Elias, the shop owner, had lived in the town since he was a boy. He told me Marrow used to play piano at the town's church. A quiet man, known to sit for hours before mirrors, speaking to himself. Rumors said he performed an ancient ritual to bring back his wife, who had died from childbirth. But the thing that came was not his wife. "That thing," Elias said, "it has no true form. It lives on memory. It feeds on what we love, then imitates it." I whispered, "It's imitating my husband." Elias nodded gravely. "It needs time to learn, but once it's done, you won't be you anymore. It'll rewrite you from the inside out." That night, Linda and I locked every door. I lit candles and placed rosary beads throughout the house, following Elias's instructions. But exactly at 3:17, everything began to fall apart. All the candles blew out at once. A fierce wind swept through, whipping the curtains into the air. On the ceiling, black handprints appeared, clearly marked. And in the living room mirror, I saw Eric. No, not Eric. This time, it didn't bother pretending. His face was warped, half of him lost in shadow, the other half showing scorched, raw flesh. He smiled, and through the mirror, I saw Linda, standing behind him, eyes rolled white. I spun around. Linda was still sitting beside me, but in the mirror, she had changed. Her skin darkened, her eyes empty. Something was copying both of us. I screamed, grabbed the vial of holy water, and flung it at the mirror. The mirror shattered, it shrieked. A terrifying sound, like hundreds of people crying out in a storm. Linda grabbed my hand, trembling. "It's not playing anymore. It's begun." I don't remember how long I was unconscious after the mirror shattered and the howling echoed through the house. When I came to, Linda was sitting beside me, holding her head, blood seeping from a deep cut on her forehead. The mirror had splintered into hundreds of pieces, But the strange thing was, not a single shard had fallen to the floor. They hovered in midair, suspended as if held by some invisible force. Each shard reflected a different image. None of them were me or Linda or anything from this world. One showed a seemingly endless hallway lined with silent, shadowy figures. Another showed the old bedroom where Eric and I used to sleep. But on the bed was a twisted body, limp as if its soul had been drained. And one shard showed Eric's face, screaming, but no sound came out. I knew then. He was trapped, Linda vehemently protested when I told her I planned to enter the world beyond the mirror. Are you insane, Meredith? We don't know what's in there. Eric is dead. You can't save a ghost. But I didn't believe he was truly gone. Not when I had seen that look in his eyes. The life still flickering in that fragment of glass. Not when I knew that entity hadn't fully taken his place. Elias once said, "Once it finishes learning, you'll no longer be you." But if I went in before it was too late, if I could reach Eric before the ritual was complete, maybe I could pull him back. I had no time to think further. The shard with Eric's image began to vibrate, emitting a sharp metallic creak like bending steel. And then it opened, not like a crack, but like a tear in the surface of water. A rift. Waiting, I stepped through. No light, no sound, only one thing. Wait. The air was thick like mud. Every step felt like wading through a sea of black tar. There was no gravity in the usual sense, but something pulled at me. A deep, numbing fatigue. All around me was eternal darkness, and yet shapes moved, slithering, crawling, breathing. A place not meant for humans. Then I heard whispering, at first gibberish. A non-human language looping endlessly, but then it became clearer. Meredith. Meredith. It's been so long. I turned. A figure stood in the distance, back facing me. Eric. I ran to him. Eric. It's me, Meredith. He turned. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as if he'd been crying for years. You shouldn't have come, he said. It's waiting for you. And as soon as he finished speaking, the world shattered. From the void, something crawled forth. It didn't walk. It slithered. Its limbs bent the wrong way, joints popping with each movement. Its body was formless, part human, part beast. Its glowing red eyes pierced the darkness. Its mouth opened, and hundreds of voices spoke at once. You arrived sooner than I expected, but no matter. I've learned enough. It lunged. I grabbed Eric and ran. Beneath our feet, the ground began to melt. Pale gray hands reached up, grasping at our legs. I screamed in my mind, "Where's the way out? Let him. Where is it?" Eric pointed. Ahead was a ring of light, a doorway. We dove into it. I opened my eyes in my living room. Linda was shaking me violently. Meredith, oh my God. You were out for almost 2 hours. Did you know? The mirror shard. It lit up and then vanished. I sat up, looked around. No more floating shards, just a blank wall, no Eric. I saw him, I whispered. I almost pulled him out, but it held on to him. Linda lowered her head, eyes glistening. We sat in silence until we heard music, a faint piano melody, like wind brushing across ivory keys. Linda heard it too. Her eyes widened. Do you hear that? She asked. I nodded, and then a knock at the door. 3 knocks, slow, growing louder. Linda walked over to open it. No one was there. Just a black envelope resting on the welcome mat. No return address. I bent down to pick it up. On its front, a single line. Want to save him? Remember where it all began. That night I dreamed. I saw myself inside the small chapel on the outskirts of town, where Eric and I had held our wedding. But in the dream, the chapel was abandoned. The windows were shattered, the altar rotting. A faded wedding photo hung from a frayed rope, and behind it, a distorted face, grinning. I jolted awake. My heart raced. Next to the bed, the rosary I had placed the night before had been torn apart, its beads scattered into a perfect circle, and in the center was a photo, our wedding photo, but my face had been burned away. I arrived at the church at dawn. The sky was still misty, the town still asleep, with only a few black crows gliding across the ash-gray sky. The church stood at the end of an old dirt road leading into the forest, a decaying wooden structure, its roof covered in moss, stained glass windows long shattered. This was once the place where I walked in wearing white, hand in hand with Eric, smiling brightly, promising never to part. Now, it looked more like a forgotten relic than a sacred space. I stepped through the old wooden doors, the hinges creaking like a groan from time itself. The air inside was thick, musty, and cold like a tomb. The pews were coated in dust, the pulpit slanted, and at the center of the nave was a broken grand piano, its lid agape like a jaw, missing half its teeth. And at the far end of the room was the mirror. I didn't recognize it at first, not until I came closer and saw the small inscription etched into the wooden frame. Meredith and Eric, 07/12/2013, a day to remember. The wedding mirror, Linda's gift, once hung in our bedroom. We had donated it to the church after the ceremony, as a way to leave behind a memory. No one ever imagined it would become the vessel between two worlds. I looked into the mirror, but I wasn't there. Only a stone chamber appeared, ancient with four walls covered in strange symbols. In the center of the room was Eric, bound to a chair, head slumped, mouth gagged with a strip of black cloth, darkness wrapped around him like bloody arms. A whisper echoed behind me. If you want him to live, you must take his place. I spun around. No one was there, but the air had changed. Wind whistled through the broken windows, sounding like soft, mournful cries. I reached out and touched the mirror. This time, it consumed me. I fell into a pitch-black void and landed on freezing stone. The room was exactly as I had seen. Wars of symbols, the smell of dried blood and ash. Eric was there, still bound, but when I touched him, his eyes opened, red and weary, but still him. No, you have to leave. A sound echoed, fingernails scraping against stone, slowly, deliberately, as if the creature was savoring the weight. Then it appeared, no longer a vague silhouette. It was almost complete now, tall, a shadow clinging to a human frame. But the face, it was mine. It smiled. Thank you. It needed a heart, a memory, pain. And now, I am you. It moved toward Eric, about to touch him. I threw myself between them. Want him to live, then take his place, it said. I looked at Eric. He shook his head. Tears rolled down his pale cheeks. I don't know what strength allowed me to do it, but I stepped into the chair. Instantly, cords slithered out of the darkness, tightening around my limbs. It felt like my skin was peeling away. Every memory ripped from my mind. Our wedding day, the first kiss, my mother's last hug. Childhood laughter. I screamed in agony. The creature shrieked too, as if feasting on fragments of my soul. But amid the chaos, Eric was pushed out of the room, through a wall of blinding light. I saw him turn back, shouting something. I couldn't hear it, but his eyes said it all. Love. I woke up in the hospital. Linda sat beside the bed, her eyes puffy and red. You've been unconscious for 2 days. Police found you lying at the church steps, alone. I asked about Eric. No one had seen him. No one believed he was still alive. But I knew he had been returned to this world. And perhaps I no longer fully belonged here. That first night back home, I looked into the mirror. Nothing strange appeared until I turned away, and my reflection was still smiling. Story 6. The Thing in the Attic. I moved into this house in early autumn last year, nestled in the quiet suburbs of a small town in Maine. The 2-story home had an old charm to it. Grey shingled roof, misted wooden windows each morning. I'm a nurse, and I came here alone after a divorce, hoping to find some peace and start life over again. The house had 3 bedrooms, a basement, and an attic. When the real estate agent gave me the tour, she brushed past the narrow staircase leading up to the attic and said, "Nothing worth seeing up there, just a storage space for old stuff." I didn't think much of it at the time. The house was too perfect for a price that seemed too good to be true. I didn't open the attic door for the entire first week. It seemed like a place not worth bothering with, and I had nothing to store up there anyway. But on the 8th night, at exactly 3 a.m., I was awakened by a faint light slipping through the crack beneath my bedroom door. I sat up, heart pounding. The light wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the narrow stairwell to the attic. The attic light was on. I remembered clearly. On move-in day, I tested the attic switch, but the light hadn't worked. I assumed it was broken and gave it no further thought. The next day, I checked again. No issues with the circuit breaker. The outlet was intact. I even removed the wall plate, carefully coiled the wires, and taped them shut just in case there was a short. So, why was the light on? I couldn't sleep after that. I tried to reassure myself. It could have been car headlights passing by, or moonlight reflecting off a mirror. But no logical explanation could erase the chill running down my spine. The next day, I installed a small camera facing the attic staircase. It would record from midnight until dawn. The second night, I woke again at 3:01 a.m. The light was on again. Could someone have entered the house? I rushed to check the doors. All locked. No signs of forced entry. I plugged the memory card into my laptop, hands trembling as I opened the footage. 3 a.m. Everything still dark. 3:01 a.m. The light suddenly flicked on. No hand, no sound, just a sudden burst of light, as if someone had entered the room above. 3:02 a.m. A figure, faceless, standing at the top of the stairs, motionless, just standing there, staring toward the camera, toward me. I nearly vomited. That wasn't human. It couldn't be. The way that shadow stood, detached completely from the space around it, without a shadow of its own, without the faintest twitch, made me feel like I was staring at something from elsewhere, something cold, an alien. I sent the video to my close friend Jake, who works in cybersecurity. He came to my house the next day. After watching the footage, his face turned pale and he whispered, "You can't stay here alone." Jake checked the entire electrical system. Nothing wrong. No signs of timer devices, no hidden cameras, no remote controls. He even climbed into the attic in broad daylight. Nothing but a rotting wooden trunk and a few dusty old picture frames. But when we opened the trunk, we found a decaying leather-bound journal and a scorched black and white photograph. The photo showed a family of 4 standing in front of this house, a father, a mother, and 2 children. The father's face had been violently scratched out, like someone had tried to rip him out of existence. The journal belonged to the mother. Her final entries dated 1967. Thomas woke again at 3 a.m., saying he was standing at the stairs. I thought it was a dream, but now I've seen the attic light too, even though I shut off the main switch last night. If anyone finds this journal, please don't let anyone sleep in that room. Jake wanted to take the journal to study it further, but I snatched it back. Something in me wanted to understand what was happening. I felt, however insane it sounded, that this house was trying to speak. The next night, I slept in the living room, camera still pointed at the attic. At exactly 3 a.m., the sound of footsteps echoed clearly. No longer just flickering light, but heavy, dragging steps thudding across the wooden floor. The camera recorded it. The same shadowy figure was no longer standing still. It was descending the stairs, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew exactly where I was hiding. Jake told me to leave immediately. I refused. I needed to know what happened in this house. I began digging through old town archives, asking neighbors, scouring property records, and I found something that made my blood run cold. The man in the photo, the home's first owner, was officially recorded as having died in that very attic, burned alive, but his body was never found. I woke up the next morning in a state of panic. Even though I had fallen asleep on the living room couch, I dreamed of the attic. In the dream, I stood in the middle of that dark room, lit only by the flickering glow of a dim light. A man stood with his back to me, wearing a scorched coat, the air thick with the smell of smoke and burnt flesh. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His face deformed, as if melted by fire, and his eyes glowed like smoldering embers. I awoke to the sound of the fire alarm blaring. In the kitchen, the oven had been turned on, though I hadn't touched it. Inside, a half-burnt photograph lay neatly on the tray. The remains of the family photo I had found in the trunk. Someone had tried to burn it, or was trying to send me a message. I decided to speak with the oldest resident in the neighborhood, Mrs. Mildred, an elderly woman in her 80s who lived 3 houses down. When I mentioned my address, her eyes immediately narrowed. "You're living in the McAllister house?" "Yes, I just moved in about 2 weeks ago." "Leave before it realizes you're there." I sat down and listened to her story. The McAllisters were once one of the wealthiest families in town during the 1960s. The father, Joseph McAllister, was rumored to be a fanatic who believed in purifying the soul through fire. One winter night, the house caught fire, starting in the attic. His wife and 2 children survived, but Joseph vanished. They said he had immolated himself to free his soul from the sins of humanity. But no one ever found his body, I recalled. Mrs. Mildred nodded, her eyes drifting off as if reliving an old memory. What remained in that attic wasn't him anymore. It was the remnants of a soul that refused to move on. And everyone who lived in that house afterward left without a word. I left her home with a heavy heart. I didn't want to believe it, but everything felt too real, too specific. That night I asked Jake to stay over. I didn't tell him everything, just said I needed company. He agreed and brought some electronic equipment to monitor the place. We set up 2 cameras, one in the living room, one just outside the attic door. Jake even installed a motion sensor on the ceiling. 2:59 a.m., the sensor buzzed faintly. A soft beep echoed. Jake jolted awake, eyes wide, as he stared at the laptop screen. I looked too. The attic hallway camera showed the light turning on. Slowly, dimly, as if an invisible hand was flipping the switch. 3:01 a.m., the sensor buzzed harder. A deep, muffled thump came from above, like footsteps on rotting floorboards. 3:03 a.m., the camera flickered, then froze. The screen went black. At that exact moment, the living room door creaked open. No wind, no one there. Just the groan of old wood and the creeping scent of smoke. I turned to Jake and saw his face pale, not from fear, but from shock. "There's someone standing behind you," Jake whispered. I froze. I didn't dare turn around. A faint shadow was reflected in the glass of the living room window. A man, tall, faceless. I spun around, nothing, but the scent of smoke lingered, thicker now, as if I was standing in the center of a slow-burning fire. Jake decided to pack up and leave. "I can't explain this," he said before walking out, "but this isn't something human-made." I stayed. I didn't understand why I didn't leave. Maybe something was anchoring me to this house. A mix of curiosity and the dreams I had started having about the children in the photo. They stood at the foot of my bed each night, silent, just staring at me, eyes empty, pleading. One night, I dreamed the little boy from the photo called my name. She locked us in the attic. She didn't want anyone to find the truth. I woke up with a bruise on my wrist, round, like the mark of fingers gripping too tightly. I had never sleepwalked. No one could have entered the house. But the bruise was real. I started digging into old medical records and uncovered something that had never been made public. The mother, Eleanor McAllister, didn't leave town after the fire, like the rumors said. She was committed to a private psychiatric facility in Massachusetts, a place reserved for dangerous patients. The reason listed: hallucinations involving fire and child endangerment. I drove to the facility the next morning, but Eleanor was dead 15 years ago. However, an elderly nurse there, Shirley, remembered her vividly. She kept talking about a door of fire where her husband's soul was waiting. She believed she had to keep the 2 children locked away to stop them from opening the door. "And how did she stop them?" I asked. Shirley was silent for a long moment before answering quietly. "I think she did something terrible in that attic." I returned home at dusk. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick as if a storm were coming. I went straight to the attic for the first time since the first night. Inside, the air was so cold I could see my breath. I dropped to my knees and scanned the rotting floorboards with my flashlight. A small crack between the planks and something metallic glinting beneath. I pried up the boards. A rusted iron box locked with a corroded padlock. I haven't opened it yet. I just sat there, staring. My heart pounded so violently, it felt like it might tear through my chest. I knew whatever was inside that box wasn't just the key to the truth. It was the doorway to a nightmare I might never escape. I didn't open the iron box right away, not because I was afraid, but because in a deeply instinctive way, I knew that once the box was opened, something would no longer be contained. I brought it down to the living room, placed it on the table, and sat a good distance away. The box was rusted but still solid. The lock was worn but not entirely corroded. It felt like it was still being protected. I stayed up all night, unable to close my eyes. At exactly 3 a.m., the attic light turned on as usual, but this time, I didn't look up. I just listened to the creaking of wood, the slow footsteps coming down the stairs, then stopping directly behind me, in the living room. I could feel it, a hot, damp breath full of the scent of ash and fire brushing against the back of my neck. And then came the whisper, "Don't open it." A low, hoarse voice, like embers crackling beneath a thick layer of ash. When I turned around, nothing was there. But the box was open. I don't know how. The lock remained untouched, but the lid had cracked open, just enough for me to see what was inside. A small leather-bound journal, a yellowed handwritten letter, and a small brass object, circular, engraved with a strange symbol resembling a twisted flame with 3 eyes at its center. I picked up the journal. The first page read, "Record of Soul Incineration Ritual, Eleanor McAllister, 1966. The following pages were short, erratic entries, like the writings of a mind unraveling. Joseph is no longer Joseph. He returned after death. No flesh, no bone, only fire and hatred. The children are lying. They are not mine. They are gateways. If not sealed, he will return. Must burn the bodies. Must close the door. Fire is the key. Fire is the end." A chill ran down my spine. Eleanor wasn't just a mother who had gone mad. She genuinely believed her husband, Joseph, had become something inhuman. And she believed the children had been taken too. I turned to the letter, presumably written to Eleanor's mother. "Mother, if I do not survive this ritual, please do not look for my body. Do not open the attic door. I've sealed him, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to hold him forever. If the fire dies, he will return, and he will find the next." At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, I saw him in the mirror. He's learning to mimic my voice. I dropped the letter. My hands were trembling. I remembered the first night in this house, the voice that called me from the stairs. I had thought I imagined it. But now, if it can mimic voices... I grabbed my phone and called Jake. "Come over tonight. Bring your gear. I need to recreate the ritual. I need to know exactly what happened." Jake went silent for a moment, then said, "Are you sure? This doesn't sound like normal paranormal stuff?" I nodded, knowing he couldn't see me. That night, Jake arrived. I told him everything. He didn't say much, just silently set up cameras, motion sensors, and a device to track temperature changes in the room. I placed the ritual journal on the table. We waited. At 2:57 a.m., the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. At 3, the light sensors began flickering rapidly. Then, the lights turned on, but this time, it wasn't just the attic. The entire house seemed to glow for a few seconds, as if an invisible flame had passed through the walls. Jake checked the equipment and replayed the footage. What we saw was unbelievable. From 3 to 3:04, the footage no longer showed my house, but a different room, older, glowing amber, its walls blackened by smoke and ash. A bald man, bare-chested, was kneeling inside a circle of fire. He had no eyes, only 2 scorched, hollow sockets. Surrounding him were the faint whispers of children, indistinct, yet echoing like hundreds of tiny voices singing in unison. Next to him, a woman stood, holding the leather journal. Eleanor, she was chanting, her voice weakening, until she collapsed as the flames surged. The screen went black. Jake whispered, "We just saw the ritual from 1966. I looked back at the journal. It was warm to the touch. I opened it. A new line had appeared, something that wasn't there before. It has seen you, and it knows who you are. The next day, I received a package, no return address. Inside was an old sheet of paper, a map of the town. A red mark was drawn on the site of an abandoned orphanage. The note read, "Joseph didn't die. He just left that house, and he left something behind." A shiver ran through me. Could part of him still exist in someone? Someone still living in this town? Or inside me? That night I dreamed I was standing in the attic, surrounded by ash. 3 small hands reached out and pulled me back, whispering, "Don't open the final door." I woke up with 2 haunting words echoing in my mind. The final door. The next morning, I drove out of town, heading north, following the map. Though it was still early, a thick mist hung in the air, making everything feel gloomy and muted. The map led me to a piece of abandoned land, fenced off by rotting wooden planks. A rusted sign tilted among the overgrown weeds, barely legible. Ravenwood Home for Children, Esto 1947. Ravenwood Orphanage. I turned off the engine, grabbed a flashlight, and carefully stepped through the broken fence. The main building was 2 stories tall. Half the roof caved in, windows shattered, wild grass creeping over the cracked stone path. Every step crunched against broken glass and scattered paper. The eerie sounds amplified by the overwhelming silence. I pushed open the front door. It gave way more easily than I expected. Inside, the air was thick with the mold, ash and charred wood. Along the hallway walls were children's drawings, most faded with time, but one remained strangely vivid. A faceless man, engulfed in flames, standing at the center of a ring of crying children. I shivered. Footsteps echoed from the floor above. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't rats. It was footsteps, slow, dragging, as if burned legs struggled to move. I turned on my flashlight and stepped onto the rickety wooden staircase. The second floor was a row of old dorm rooms. I checked the first room, empty. The second, also empty, but in the third, someone was there. A man, around 50, thin and gaunt, sat on the floor, eyes vacant, staring out the window. He didn't react when I entered. I spoke softly. "Excuse me, who are you?" After a long pause, he finally answered, his voice a whisper like wind through cracked walls. "You hear them too, don't you?" "The children." I nodded. He gave a faint smile, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who had lived too long inside a nightmare no one believed was real. His name was Walter. One of the last children to survive Ravenwood before the orphanage was shut down in 1973 after a fire, one that was never officially reported. He said that year, a mysterious man arrived at the orphanage claiming to be a religious volunteer. He had no name. We just called him the preacher because he taught us how to pray. But it wasn't God he wanted us to worship. He spoke of purifying fire, of the gates of hell opening from the sins of abandoned children. Walter told me that on a winter night, the entire orphanage was woken for a ceremony. Only a few children, he said, were deemed worthy of offering. The man led them to the attic, where he had drawn a ritual circle using ash and chicken blood. He spoke a language I'd never heard. Not Latin, not anything human. That's when I heard them. Screams from beyond the door. Walter escaped by climbing out a second-story window. But before jumping, he turned back and saw that the man was no longer human. His robe had burned away, his flesh melted like wax, and his eye sockets burned with red fire. I knew then. It was Joseph McAllister, Walter said. He didn't die in that house. He left, continued the ritual somewhere else. He wants to open more gates. I pulled the ritual book from my bag. Walter instantly backed away. You shouldn't have that. It's a key. The longer you hold it, the clearer he sees you. I asked if there was a way to stop Joseph. Walter stared into my eyes, his gaze cutting deep. You must burn the place where he began his first ritual. The attic, but not just burn it. You have to complete the rite, seal it again, and your blood will be the final offering. I left Ravenwood by sunset, my head spinning. On the way home, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a child sitting in the back seat. But when I turned around, no one was there. By the time I got home, night had fallen. The wind howled through the window frames, tapping at the walls like clawed fingers. I opened the ritual book and marked Eleanor's listed steps. Create a circle of ash. Place the fire symbol, the three-eyed coin, at the center. Speak the sealing incantation. Offer blood. Willingly. Burn all in purifying flame. I didn't know if I had the strength to do it, but I knew if I didn't, Joseph wouldn't stop. That night, Jake called me. You need to see this, he said, panic in his voice. He sent a video, footage from my home security camera, the exact moment I was away at Ravenwood. 3 a.m., the front door slowly opened, and a woman walked in, wearing a nightgown identical to mine. She walked straight to the attic stairs, looked directly into the camera, and smiled. Her eyes were burning red. I had watched the video Jake sent over and over again, until I had memorized every frame. The woman in it didn't just look like me. She was me. From her walk, the way she brushed her hair back, to the silver-gray nightgown I had thrown into the donation box 2 weeks ago. She stepped through the door like someone who had lived there for years, eerily familiar. And when the attic stairway light flicked on, she turned toward the camera and smiled. A smile without soul. A smile that had never belonged to me. I called Jake, but he didn't answer. I texted. No reply. A chill ran down my spine, like winter wind slicing through skin. Deep inside, I felt hollow, as if I was slowly fading and she was taking my place, one step at a time. That night, I decided to perform the ritual. I prepared the ash collected from the old fireplace. The triple spiral brass sigil was placed at the center of the circle. The leather-bound book lay nearby. The razor blade for drawing blood sat on the right. I arranged everything exactly as Eleanor had documented. Before beginning, I locked every door, drew the curtains over every window. I turned on a voice recorder, filmed the entire ritual on my phone, just in case. I didn't make it through to tell the story myself. The attic was pitch dark, save for a single candle I had planted in the center. The flickering light made my shadow on the walls dance with each breath I took. I sat down inside the ash circle and read the first invocation from the book. By fire, I name the one who has crossed the threshold between worlds. By blood, I bind him to the place he belongs. By soul, I pay the price to seal him away. I sliced my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the sigil. Nothing happened at first. Then the flame roared to life, burning violently as if struck by a gust of wind, though every door was shut. The attic grew hotter, the wooden planks groaning beneath me. A guttural roar echoed from somewhere beneath the floor. Not human. It sounded like a beast being burned alive, shrieking and ripping through space in unbearable agony. I continued reading the final passage. Return to where you came from. The door is closed. The fire is the end. A fierce wind erupted in the sealed room. Old photos on the walls fell to the floor. A plume of black smoke rose from a corner, swirling into the form of a person. No face, just shadow. A burning figure made of darkness. A light with black flame from within. I tried not to look at it, tried to finish the incantation, but my throat locked up as it spoke. You think one ritual is enough? That voice. It was identical to mine. Every word it said echoed like it came from inside my skull. I grabbed the brass sigil and hurled it into the fire. The flames exploded. A burst of blinding white light engulfed the room. Then, silence. I collapsed onto the floor. Drained. The shadow was gone. The flames were gone. The attic returned to its cold, ashen stillness. I thought I had done it. But as I descended the stairs, I saw Jake standing in the living room. His eyes were vacant. He said, "You did it wrong." I backed away, my heart pounding. Jake took a step forward, then pointed at me. "You summoned him. You didn't seal him. You misread the final verse. You didn't lock the door. You opened it." I stared at Jake, but the eyes staring back weren't his. His irises turned pitch black, glowing faintly red like burning embers beneath ash. I took another step back, fumbling for the knife in my pocket, hands trembling. "You're not Jake," he smiled. "I'm the voice in your head, the thing in your blood, long before you ever came here." I nearly collapsed against the wall, and then I remembered what Walter had told me. Your blood is the final piece. Not just any blood, mine. I was born on March 3rd, raised in a different orphanage not far from Ravenwood. I never knew who my parents were. I used to dream of fire, even as a child. I had never paid attention to those coincidences, but now I understood. I wasn't just a victim. I was what Joseph left behind after the first ritual. I was the final key. Jake, or whatever had become of him, moved closer. That's when a loud knock slammed against the door like thunder. Someone burst in. It was Walter. He shouted, "Don't let him touch you. Say the ending right." I wrote it down. Walter threw me a scrap of paper. I caught it and read aloud. "By blood born of fire, by words from the bearer of buried memory, I seal you in the very form you created." Jake screamed, clutching his head as cracks spread across his face like a burning mask. I kept reading. The room shook violently. Objects lifted and slammed into the walls. Flames surged one last time, then everything shattered in a silent blast. When I woke up, daylight had broken. Jake lay unconscious on the floor, back to his real self but barely breathing. Walter was gone, as if he had never been there. The cameras had recorded nothing, but I knew that night was real. I sealed the book, the brass sigil, and the remaining ash inside a wooden box, buried it deep in the backyard, sprinkled salt, and surrounded it with a garlic braid, just as Walter had instructed. But I also knew it was only temporary, because every night, at exactly 3 a.m., I still see the attic light flicker in the mirror. Story 7. The dead are sending messages. My name is Amanda Rowe, and I never believed in the supernatural. At least, not until last fall, when I began receiving messages from Layla Green, my best friend in high school, who had died 3 years ago. It started on a Friday night after a late shift at the small bookstore downtown in Maple Hollow, Oregon. I was driving along the familiar, deserted hillside road that led to the rental house near the edge of Pinecrest Forest, where I lived alone. That night, a light rain fell. Fog blanketed the pavement, and my headlights barely pierced a few feet ahead. It was 10:43 p.m. I remember clearly because the clock on my dashboard began flickering erratically before freezing at that exact time. My phone also lost signal, even though that area normally had perfect reception. As I turned a corner near the old cemetery, the one locals whispered about, where several disappearances had occurred, I felt my phone vibrate. A message had arrived from an unknown number, no name in my contacts. Remember? Back in 11th grade, we skipped class to pick strawberries on the hill behind school. My heart skipped a beat. Hardly anyone knew that. It was such a small, intimate memory. And Layla was the only one who ever brought it up again. I frowned, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was someone playing a prank or an old classmate reminiscing by coincidence. But an eerie unease began to crawl into my bones. I replied, "Who is this?" Less than 5 seconds later, another message appeared. "It's me, Layla." I slammed on the brakes so hard my tires screeched across the wet pavement. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, at the name of someone who should not be contacting me. Layla had died in a car accident on her way back from Seattle. They said she died on impact, her body barely recognizable when they found it. I didn't reply. I floored the gas pedal and drove home as fast as I could, trying to shake the chill settling at the base of my neck. That night, I couldn't sleep. I curled up beside the window, staring out at the pine forest behind my house, where the darkness seemed thicker than usual. The next morning, I woke in a daze. On the kitchen table, my phone had 3 more messages, all from that same number. "Don't take that road again. Something is watching you. I'll protect you, Amanda." I hadn't told anyone. How could I? Who would believe me if I said my dead friend was sending messages from the other side? But deep down, something was beginning to stir. A question I had never dared ask. Did Layla really die the way they said she did? I decided to visit her old house, where she had lived with her parents. Her mother, Mrs. Joanne, still lived there alone. I hesitated at the gate, hand trembling as I rang the bell. She opened the door with tired, hollow eyes, like someone who had never moved on from grief. "I'm Amanda, Layla's friend," I said, my voice cracking. She nodded slowly. "I remember you. Come in." The house felt frozen in time. Photos of Layla hung on every wall. She led me into the living room, where a small shrine stood. On it was a photo of Layla, smiling brightly, holding a bunch of crimson strawberries. I swallowed hard. It was that photo, the one we took when we skipped school in 11th grade. The only copy, and we were the only ones who had it. I told her about the messages, about the memories they were bringing back. Her eyes widened. Then, she reached into a drawer and pulled out an old phone with a cracked screen. I wasn't going to tell anyone. But a few months after Layla died, I got a message from her number. I froze. It was just one sentence. I haven't left yet. There's something I still need to finish. We sat in silence. The wind whistled through the window cracks, like distant whispers drifting through time. Mrs. Joanne squeezed my hand. If you're still getting messages, maybe Layla's trying to warn you. Her death, it wasn't an accident. That night when I returned home, I found the back door ajar, though I knew I had locked it. In the kitchen, every dish had fallen from the rack and shattered on the floor. No signs of forced entry. No one else had a key. I called the police. They found nothing unusual, except for one detail. The security camera system had lost all footage between 2:11 a.m. and 2:34 a.m. At 2:17 a.m., I received a video. No subject line, no note, sent from the same unknown number. It was blurry, handheld footage from inside a forest, like it had been shot on a phone. A figure stood motionless in the middle of a clearing, back turned, long hair covering her face. She didn't move, but after a few seconds, her head began to turn. Slowly, inches at a time, until it stopped. Just as her face was about to become visible, the screen went black. A single white line appeared at the end. The empty road will open, but not everyone returns. I didn't sleep that night. After watching the video, I turned on every light in the house, checked every window and lock, and finally curled up in the living room with a kitchen knife in hand. But the fear didn't come from the thought of someone breaking in. It came from the strange familiarity of the figure in the video. Not because I could see her face. The clip was too blurry and brief. But because I felt like she had once stood behind me. The next morning, I called in sick at the bookstore and drove to the city library to look up the records of Layla's accident. The police had concluded she lost control on a mountain road. Her car veered off the cliff and caught fire. Her body was only identified through DNA. But I discovered something strange. The time of the crash was 11:02 p.m. The same night, I had also driven through that road. Only a few minutes later. I had never made the connection. Until now. The librarian was a thin old man named Vernon, who seemed to have worked there for decades. When I asked about the accident, he stared at me for a long time before finally speaking, his voice raspy and low. That road, Pine Hollow Pass. It's not for the faint of heart. I was about to ask more when Mr. Vernon lowered his voice, eyes darting around the room. Did you hear about the 2 college students who went missing last year? I nodded. I'd heard the story. News reports said they'd gotten lost while camping. Nothing about a car accident. Mr. Vernon handed me a thin file. Inside was a copy of the missing persons report, along with a handwritten note found in one of their backpacks. We heard someone calling our names from the woods, but when we turned around, no one was there. I shivered. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just Layla. That road, that empty road, was hiding something more than coincidence. I left the library with my head spinning. But as I got into my car, my phone buzzed. A new message. You have to go to the abandoned house at the end of the road. They hid it there. I'm being followed. I didn't know. But the name abandoned house stopped me cold. There really was such a place. Locals called it the Old Mercer House, a decaying home abandoned since the 1960s, just about a mile from Pine Hollow. Rumors said it once belonged to a family of undertakers, and after a mysterious fire, it had remained empty ever since. Kids in town used to say anyone who went in never came out with their sanity intact. I didn't think I'd ever go back there. But that night, while I was making tea in the kitchen, the lights went out. No wind, no thunder, just darkness, sudden and absolute, still and bone-chilling. The phone rang, shattering the silence. I lit up the screen. An unknown number. The screen showed a single word. Layla. I lifted the phone to my ear, hand trembling. Amanda. A whisper, distant, like it came from the bottom of a well. Don't trust anyone, even if they say they want to help. I tried to respond, but all I heard was a long exhale, followed by a high-pitched shriek, like metal being scraped against metal, stabbing through my eardrum. The coal dropped. The screen went black, and in that very moment, I heard footsteps from upstairs. I live alone. The kitchen knife was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I grabbed the flashlight and ran up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The second floor was pitch dark. All the doors were open, but as I approached the bedroom, the door slammed shut right in front of me, making me scream. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hand shaking uncontrollably. Written across the door, in red ink, "Don't go back, unless you want to be the next one." I left the house that night. The next morning, I contacted Calvin, Layla's ex-boyfriend. He was now a freelance photographer, living in a neighboring town. When I mentioned the message from the unknown number, I saw the color drain from his face. He pulled out his phone and opened a series of old messages from the same number. "I got them too," Calvin said, "about a month ago, but I didn't tell anyone. The messages kept saying I had to return what I took." "What did you take?" "I don't know. I really don't." Calvin didn't look like he was lying, but something in his eyes. He was hiding something. I had no other choice. I needed the truth. I needed to end this before it consumed everything. That night I drove to the old Mercer house. Alone. The abandoned house was hidden behind thick pines, almost invisible from the road. Part of the roof had collapsed, the windows shattered, the front door hanging from rusty hinges. The smell of rot and old ash hit me the moment I stepped inside. I crept through the dark hallway, flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard it. Knocking, soft, rhythmic. From the basement I froze. 1, 2, 3 knocks. Then a voice, quiet but unmistakable. "Amanda." I stood paralyzed. "You came." Layla's voice. I was never a brave person, but in that moment, standing in the thick darkness of the old Mercer house, with Layla's voice whispering from beneath the basement, I walked toward the sound as if pulled by an invisible string. My hand gripped the flashlight, but its tiny beam couldn't chase away the cold crawling up my spine. The basement door was heavy and groaned as I pushed it open. A putrid stench hit me like a wave, making me gag. The smell of rot, moldy wood, and something like decaying animal flesh. I descended the stairs, each step creaking sharply, echoing as if someone were following just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. The basement wasn't entirely dark. A pale, cold blue light glowed from the far corner. As I got closer, I saw it was a phone screen, an old iPhone lying on the filthy floor. Next to it sat a round object wrapped in layers of faded fabric, like a doll, though far too strange to be a child's toy. I crouched down, hands trembling, as I picked up the phone. The screen showed an unread message. "You're about to see the truth, but it won't be the way you remember it, Amanda. Just as I finished reading, the flashlight died.